My biggest concern is leaves. People in residential neighborhoods may not be so stringent or religious about cleaning up their leaves. It's very disconcerting not being able to see what the surface is as you roll over. Also, poorly maintained sidewalks have got lots of um, pits or holes that accumulate water. Will also be disconcerting because you can't tell the depth of the sidewalk and what's going on. My experience more recently with my mother, who's 83 now, I used to use a walker to walk around because of Parkinson's disease and hip replacement surgery. Um, that opened my eyes up more to the fact that imperfections can really debilitate somebody who wants to get around, but an inconvenience or a crack or inconsistent surfaces, this angle left or right, um, can really be disconcerting or slow somebody down or make them fall. And just like a new road is fun to drive on in a car, a new sidewalk will also encourage everybody to walk around and get out more. They'll feel safer underfoot, they'll feel safer from cars. Sidewalks are, no pun intended, but pun intended, the highway to like a better life. I rely on sidewalks to do basically everything. Sidewalks.
Were there only two, Kate?
I thought that there was a third one, but I am not seeing it pop up. Um,
Okay, I just wanted to make sure I thought there was a third one.
well, there's actually several of them. They weren't all embedded in there, but I'm going to drop the link to the Disability Mobility Initiative's YouTube. So if it'll paste, my computer froze. There it is. And then we'll get started. Hello, everyone. My name is Kate Rubin. My pronouns are she, her, and I am the organizing director at Be Seattle. I'm joined tonight by our operations director, Tanya Moore, our programs assistant, Dee Powers, and our guest speakers, Jamie Ptacek, communications manager for the Clean Energy Transition Institute, Tanisha Sepúlveda, program coordinator for the Empower Movement, Washington, EMWA, and Cecelia Black, community organizer for Disability Mobility Initiative at Disability Rights Washington. The video that I left out was Cecilia's, so please go to their YouTube channel and check it out. I'm going to start us off with a land acknowledgement. We are on the land of the Coast Salish peoples. I would like to recognize that we are occupying the traditional land of the first people of Seattle, the Duwamish people, past and present, and honor with gratitude the land itself and the Duwamish tribe. As we do this important work on these lands, we understand that our collective liberation cannot happen without Indigenous sovereignty. We encourage each of you to sign the petition for federal recognition of the Duwamish tribe. And if you're able, visit the Longhouse and pay rent to the Duwamish. You can learn more from Real Rent Duwamish. We'll also include a link for them in the resource guide that will be sent after the presentation. Our resource guide also contains contact information for the Renting in Seattle helpline, the Seattle Department of Construction and Inspections, also known as SDCI. They're responsible for enforcing landlord-tenant laws, the Seattle Office for Civil Rights, as well as a bunch of other organizations that provide services to renters. We encourage you to get more involved with Be Seattle. We're seeking table volunteers, folks to hang up flyers, people interested in developing their skills as part of a tenant leadership team. We host 2 renter council meetings every month. The Elder Renter Council, which centers renters age 55 plus, and the Seattle Renter Organizing Council. These councils were created for renters to work together to strategize and fight for renter protections that they feel are important to their communities, give and receive peer-to-peer support for folks organizing in their buildings, grow renter power, and build community. We'll drop links to sign up for the email list in the chat. So I'm just going to share a few upcoming events, and then we'll jump into the presentation. Wednesday, March 13th, 3 to 4:45 p.m. online via Zoom. Solid Ground presents Rent Smart, info for domestic violence survivors. Join Solid Ground to discuss tenants' rights and procedures under the Washington State Residential Landlord-Tenant Act. Learn how to break a lease without liability after an incident of abuse. Report an incident to a qualified third party. Try to get an eviction off your tenant screening report and get a security deposit back. A visiting attorney from the Tenant Law Center will also be on hand to help with answering questions. Thursday, March 14th, 6:30 to 8:30 p.m. at El Centro de la Raza in room 311, which is Roberto Maestros Digital Literacy Lab, or online via Zoom. It's the next meeting of the Seattle Renter Organizing Council. We'll continue working on how to get the city on track for the Office of Rental Housing Standards Work Group, and talk about how we can just show up for the renters of Seattle. Come help us advocate, organize, and educate. Wednesday, March 20th, 12:30 to 2:30 p.m. Also at El Centro de la Raza. It's the next Elder Renter Council meeting. So we'll drop the link to sign up there. Tuesday, March 26th, 5:30 to 6:30 p.m. online via Zoom. It's the RAP King County Regional Call. So the aim of RAP, also known as the Resident Action Project, is to build a statewide network of people who are directly impacted by housing and homelessness issues who are leading the charge for social change. Gain organizing, advocacy, and policy skills by attending RAP's monthly regional Zoom meetings on the fourth Tuesday of every month at 5:30 p.m. And RAP is a project of the Washington Low Income Housing Alliance. Wednesday, March 27th, 6 to 8 p.m. Via Zoom. It's our next Building Tenant Power Workshop, Defending Seattle's Renter Protections. I don't know if any of y'all tuned into the Housing and Homelessness Committee meeting, but that was this morning, the landlords came out in force against our current renter protections. And the council seemed terrifyingly open to changing them. So we will all work together to talk about what we can do as renters to make sure that our protections stay in place. Saturday, March 30th, noon to 4 p.m. at the Rainier Community Center. It's the Community Health and Wellness Fair presented by Marvin Thomas Memorial, YMCA, Holistic Coalition, CompuKids Worldwide. There will be giveaways, food, live performances, fresh produce, nutrition education, healthcare providers, food demos, and more. You can go to their Instagram, Health and Wellness Fair Washington, for more information. And then finally, Wednesday, April 10th, 3 to 4:45 p.m. online via Zoom, Solid Ground presents Rent Smart Fees and Deposits. Have you ever been charged a fee by your landlord and you don't know why? Is it even legal? Or have you vacated from a rental and you didn't get your deposit back? Join this webinar from Solid Ground tenant counselors and legal advisors to discuss which fees landlords are permitted to impose and which ones are illegal. Learn about deposits when applying for a new rental and how to go about getting your deposit back when you move out. A visiting attorney from the Tenant Law Center will be on hand to answer questions. And now I'd like to introduce our first speaker of the night, Jamie Ptacek, she, her. Jamie has spent the past decade working for several nonprofit organizations on campaigns to address issues at the intersection of climate change and social justice on the local, state, and national levels. She has worked as a campaign manager, organizer, and communications specialist with the Sunrise Movement, Citizens Climate Lobby, FutureWise, and Disability Rights Washington. Jamie's most recent organizing work led to the passage of 10 bills in the Washington State Legislature that will address Washington's response to climate change, housing affordability, environmental protection, transportation access, and racial equity. Her current role is as the communications manager for the Clean Energy Transition Institute, where she works to accelerate an equitable clean energy transition in the Northwest. Jamie is going to talk about land use and transit-oriented development. Take it away, Jamie.
Awesome. Thank you so much. Let me just get my screen up here. Thank you for that introduction. I'm very excited to be here. I'm Jamie. I use she, hers pronouns. And as Kate mentioned, I'm currently working with the Clean Energy Transition Institute, But prior to this role, I come from the organizing world and spent quite a bit of time organizing on the state level in Washington to address issues at the intersection of housing, transit, climate, and equity. So tonight I'm going to give a high-level overview of how land use impacts our housing and transportation systems. I think given that you all are involved with B Seattle, you won't be surprised by a lot of these things. So hopefully this information isn't too redundant. And then why it's really critical for accessibility, equity, and climate resilience that we're advocating collectively for denser and more interconnected communities. So first off, as I'm sure you know, housing is super expensive, and a lot of our communities in Washington are extraordinarily car-centric. We don't currently have enough affordable housing units to meet the needs of moderate to extremely low-income Washingtonians. There's nearly a 2,000 unit gap in the number of affordable units that we need to have to meet the need of folks, and 30% of people in the state are burdened by housing costs. Washington also now ranks 7th in the US for our rates of homelessness. And Seattle in particular is really confronting this issue. Again, I don't think any of this is news to anybody on this call, but we're one of the fastest growing large cities in the past decade, and we have been seeing super rapid escalation in our rent and housing prices. This has placed low income and BIPOC communities, especially at a really increased risk of being displaced, and folks are being forced to move further from where they work and go to school and where their communities are to access housing they can afford. And often that housing is not connected by frequent transit or by continuous safe bike and pedestrian infrastructure, as we were seeing in those videos at the top of the call. For people who do own their own vehicles, this means spending more time driving and more money on their cars, and that's not only costly for families and for individuals, but single occupancy vehicle emissions and infrastructure are really bad for our climate. In Washington, in particular, the transportation sector is our #1 contributor to our state's greenhouse gas emissions. And of the 30% of people in Washington who are non-drivers, and many more who either can't afford their own car or choose not to have a car, this can result in really long and logistically complex journeys to access very basic human needs. I'm going to drop 2 links in the chat. One is a pretty cool site that has more specific demographics on Washington's housing cost burden. And the other is a study by the Just Transportation Committee on non-drivers in Washington that was delivered to the legislature, which is pretty interesting as well. And yeah, so we simply can't address the housing crisis without also considering how our transportation system impacts people's ability to move freely and safely throughout the world. We not only need to produce enough affordable housing to meet the needs of all Washingtonians, but we need to really reimagine how we want our communities to look to ensure that the housing we build is dense and that it's integrated into complete communities with abundant and accessible services, and that all of that is connected by really reliable and frequent transit. Everybody deserves to have a safe and affordable and stable place to live, and we all deserve to be able to walk and bike and roll or take really reliable transit to work and school and the grocery store and doctor's appointments and concerts, and to just be able to live our lives without having to rely on a car. And most importantly, all of this reimagining really needs to be community-led, and it needs to take into account existing and historic discrimination in both housing and transit planning. And I think it's possible to make this vision a reality in Washington and in Seattle. And there are several strategies we can leverage to get there. I'll talk about transit-oriented development in just a sec, but first I want to touch on Washington's Growth Management Act. This is one of our primary tools for impacting how cities and counties plan for housing and transportation, and it was this body of legislation that I spent a lot of my time at FutureWise working on. So the GMA is a statewide framework, and it guides how our counties and local governments have to plan to manage and accommodate population growth, and it dictates what elements they have to consider in their comprehensive plans, which they update every 10 years. The map on the right of this screen shows which counties are required to plan fully under the GMA. Those are the counties in green. So that means they have to account for all of the Growth Management Act's required elements. And then the counties in blue are ones who were not required to plan because they're not big enough, but they opted in to plan fully anyways. And then the counties in gray just have to plan to protect critical areas and natural resource lands. So there's a whole list, and you can look up on the Washington Legislature website about the Growth Management Act if you want to really get into these wonky weeds. But some of the primary reason that Growth Management Act was first created was to prevent urban sprawl, to concentrate growth in urban areas, and in that way protect our rural lands and our critical habitats. Cities and counties are also required to plan for housing and transportation and essential public facilities, including transportation facilities. However, in 2020, when I started working for FutureWise, the housing element of the Growth Management Act was really weak. It pretty much just suggested that counties be thinking about how they could maybe provide more housing for people, but didn't have any really strict standards for what that meant. The transportation element was not meeting the needs of non-drivers. It was very focused on people who use cars to get around. And there was not a requirement that states and counties do anything to plan for the impacts of climate change. So while I was organizing with FutureWise, we ran what became a 3-year campaign to address these deficiencies. And we made some pretty big strides. In 2021, House Bill 1220 was signed into law, and that strengthened the Growth Management Act's housing element. So now cities and counties are required to plan for a diversity of housing types. So not just single family homes and not just high-rise apartments, but a lot of that missing middle housing. So duplexes, triplexes, and quads that meet the needs of folks at every income level. It also requires that they allow for more permanent supportive housing and emergency shelters, which has long been a barrier to providing our neighbors who are experiencing homelessness with dignified shelter. It also tackles the very long and shameful history of racial discrimination in our housing policies by requiring jurisdictions to assess and redress the impacts of things like redlining and racial covenants on BIPOC communities. And then, really importantly, cities have to identify communities that are at a high risk for displacement and implement policies and programs and regulations that will keep people from getting priced out of their neighborhoods. So that was a really big win. And then in 2023, the legislature passed House Bill 1181, which really brought together this sort of housing, transportation, and climate nexus of issues. It both added a climate change element to the Growth Management Act and also updated the transportation element. So now cities and counties who are fully planning under the Growth Management Act have to make plans to protect communities and vulnerable populations from the impacts of the climate crisis. So thinking about forest fires and extreme heat and more extreme storms and all of these things that we're seeing every year in Washington. And then they also have to make plans to reduce their greenhouse gas emissions and their vehicle miles traveled to meet our state goals for reductions. And we know that the best way to accomplish this, and the way that a lot of counties and cities are thinking about meeting this requirement, is to build denser housing in complete communities where folks don't have to rely on cars to get around. And then these final 2 provisions were things I worked on while I was at Disability Rights Washington. One is a requirement that jurisdictions now have to use a multimodal level of service to assess their transportation systems, and they have to develop transportation plans that address multimodal transportation, so not just cars, but biking and walking and taking transit. And they need to ensure that all of their transportation systems are safely, reliably, and efficiently providing access and mobility to everyone. And then there's another provision that requires that all jurisdictions are ensuring that their transportation facilities are accessible by ADA regulations. So as counties and cities go through their next comprehensive plan update cycles, which the city of Seattle is wrapping up right now, they are having to incorporate all of these new requirements and elements into their housing and transportation planning, which is super exciting. Another strategy that advocates were pushing for in the 2024 state legislative session in Washington, which is happening right now, is something called transit-oriented development, or TOD. And TOD is a type of development that increases the density of homes and businesses that are near transit, like light rail and bus rapid transit and commuter rail, which makes it a lot easier for more people to get where they need to go without a car. In 2023, the Washington State Legislature considered it was called House Bill 2160 or Senate Bill 6024, and it would have set a state standard for transit-oriented development to require that cities and counties are doing this type of development work. And advocates were pushing for this legislation to include provisions that housing was affordable and that the planning efforts would be conducted equitably and led by communities for communities. The bill unfortunately died on Monday, which means that it did not make it out of committee before a kind of arbitrary cutoff date. But it will likely be back in the 2025 legislative session and will really need all hands on deck. So definitely stay tuned for ways you can get involved to make sure that gets over the finish line next year. And really quickly before I wrap up, what are some things you can do now? As I mentioned, the Seattle is going through its comprehensive planning process, and the period for public comment on the plan itself has closed, but you can always attend the Seattle Planning Commission's monthly meetings to stay up to date on how they're implementing that plan and to provide public feedback. And then just in general, advocate. You all are already here, you're involved with Be Seattle, but there's a lot of other great organizations like Disability Rights Washington and FutureWise who are working on issues of housing and transit on the state and local level. So I'll drop links to all three of these things in the chat. And yeah, I encourage folks to get involved, and please reach out if you have any questions about any of this. And that's all from me.
Thank you so much, Jamie. Now I'd like to introduce our guest speaker, Tanisha Sepúlveda. Tanisha is an architectural associate for BCRA and program coordinator for Empower Movement Washington, a coalition of BIPOC and disabled mobility advocates supported by Disability Rights Washington, DRW, and Front and Centered. She is also co-coordinator for the non-driver seminars hosted by the Disability Mobility Initiative through DRW. As a power wheelchair user since 2010, she recognizes the lack of accessibility in the built environment and advocates for equitable access to transit and housing with a focus on sidewalk repair and maintenance. Thank you for being here.
Thank you for having me. Pull up my all right. So thank you everyone. And as I was introduced, my name is Tanisha Sepúlveda. I'm a program coordinator for Empower Movement Washington. And we are a group of BIPOC-led disabled advocates across Washington state. We advocate for equitable transit and housing policies. And here photoed is some of our members over a retreat this summer. We actually got to meet with everybody, which was great. You know, it's just a very interesting perspective when you get a group of people in a room with a wide range of disabilities, and just, you know, different areas of Washington. So you get different perspectives of rural versus suburban versus urban. And we're also pictured here with former Seattle Mike McGinn and Senator Saldana. We were also involved this year with the Week Without Driving. And so I'm sure many of you have heard or even participated in the Week Without Driving. And with that, it's the goals of trying to get people to understand the challenges, you face when you're trying to access transit and what that's like for non-drivers across Washington state. As Jamie had mentioned earlier, there's plenty of people living in areas that need to access transit because of a lack, either they don't have a vehicle, can't afford the cost, it's very costly, or simply, just don't have access to that, may have a fear of driving, there may be a disability or may not be. But it does encompass about 30% of Washington state population as far as it being non-drivers. And so having people on the ground who are making the decisions and being able to actually see kind of firsthand what it's like for us to get around every day can really make a difference. And so this year, with it going national, we were able to, have 142 different advocacy organizations and 10 different national organizations, multiple elected leaders and advocates across the nation. Here's some photos from different areas. Denver and Kansas. Of course, here in Seattle with the Transit Riders Union. And multiple headlines. And so we're very excited about all of the just support that this was getting, because getting to transit is a big a big priority as far as something that's overlooked constantly, it seems like. Getting transit made is, seems to be in the forefront, and having transit stops. However, it seems like sidewalks are often left out. And here in Seattle, it's the burden of the property owner. And that's why, for us, it's about sidewalks being for everyone. And I'm sure everyone here is familiar with these sidewalks where trees are overgrowing into the path. And so it causes these uprises. And of course, we don't want to eliminate the trees, but we need to be able to fix the sidewalks more than a simple shim and bevel type situation. Or some of these even get far worse, where it creates a slope that makes it, unmanageable for people with limited mobility. Here are some photos from the Seattle Times of Lamar and I trying to get around. This is a tree situation here. And then an overgrown hedge situation, which actually caused my wheel to go down maybe into a 2-inch kind of drop. But because of the way and positioning, and if it were muddy or gravel, I would need someone to help maneuver me in my almost 500-pound of wheelchair back up onto the sidewalk. And as helpful as people are, not everybody can do that. That's a lot of weight. And so these are some of the obstacles that also get forgotten about. It's seasonal. It's great that the snow and everything gets out in the road. However, it always gets pushed up onto the sidewalk and curb cuts get blocked. Someone like me, I cannot pass through that. It's just too high, too much of a mess, and I can't imagine having a manual chair or even trying to push a stroller through that, or for the elderly. Anybody who can't really pick up their feet too high, that's not going to be a comfortable, journey. And also with the leaves, again, this being the property owner's responsibility, it makes it really difficult. Not everybody can get out and do maintenance or, simple raking or snow shoveling. Many people are elderly or disabled, and even if they aren't, some people don't even realize that it's their responsibility. And when the leaves fall, it often covers up sidewalks like this. So here we are. And this is just pointing out how that there is no comprehensive data on sidewalks. And this is very important as to why, non-drivers, people with disabilities, transit riders should be involved in the transit making decisions, whether it's, the infrastructure of getting to or just simple access. This is a big reason why we're pushing for universal design and why that, encompassing everybody's needs is really important and valuable. And even then, universal design still has, some improvements, but it's far, far better than ADA. And even that right now seems to be the bare minimum, and that's not enough. Here we have photos of like lowered light, elevator buttons, wide ramps. This photo up here in the top center, this light grayed out area was formerly a push button, but as you can see, the wheelchair cannot access that push button, so they had to make a mini pole here. And then just to kind of wrap it up in saying how it isn't often brought up, but how redlining is a big issue. Like I live in a historically redlined area. Many people do. And we feel like that's a big focus on areas that should be looked into, because even though I live in West Seattle and what's considered a well-served and maintained area, there's definitely pockets like White Center and Highland Park, High Point area that definitely need maintenance done on the sidewalks, curb cuts, shelters, that are historically overlooked, and how this has been, affected over long term. Lack of maintenance, lack of funding, lack of attention, lack of care. And then just, saying how disinvestment in redline neighborhoods have shown that there are fewer sidewalks and parks and places for people to go, and that affects people's health overall. And so this is why that's really important to have these neighborhoods that not only have affordable, accessible housing, but they're also not, a cement jungle, as they say, and that there's actually access to parks and playgrounds and places for people to gather recreationally, and also have access to simple needs. And also saying that this would be cheaper, when we build for pedestrians versus building for cars. Over time, the wear and tear is less, maintenance is less, and, we should focus on our community more. And so that's a big part of, kind of our focus and what we believe in. And then just to show how much space we leave for people versus vehicles, as I'm sure you know, it's a lot, and it should be the other way around. And so, yeah, that is pretty much the conclusion of what I have to add in there. It's just the work we're trying to do is to push more for, housing, accessible, affordable housing, not only having transit access that, but if it's going to be pushed out of the city because rent is so high, then transit also needs to follow. Accessible sidewalks need to follow on top of that. There are often barriers that are overlooked, especially for people with disabilities. The fact that curb cuts are ending, there's no crosswalks, there's no shelters, there's no lighting, and all of these would only benefit everybody. So yeah, thank you.
Right. It's my turn now. Thank you so much, Tanisha. That was amazing. Our next speaker is Cecelia Black, who will be discussing Seattle's next transportation levy, what it is, how it impacts this, and how we can impact the future of Seattle's transportation systems. Cecelia is a community organizer for Disability Mobility Initiative at Disability Rights Washington, where she works with non-drivers and people with disabilities to fight for transportation justice. Outside of DMI, Cecelia is a photographer and serves as our amazing board president. In 2022, Cecelia created Deconstructing Access Tests, an ongoing video-based art project about sidewalk accessibility with gallery shows at the River for Culture and Soil this coming fall. So I'm going to hand it over to Cecelia.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you for having me. I put in a link for a week without driving. We have a website now that Tanisha talked about. So if you're interested in getting involved or just want to check out updates, yeah, check out the website and sign up. The week without driving is, I think it's the last week of September this year. I'm going to share my screen. I just want to warn you, this is a very ugly PowerPoint. So if you cannot see it, you're not missing anything. Yeah, and so I am not necessarily a transportation expert, but I've spent a lot of time in the last year digging through all of the SDOT documents and plans. And so sometimes I think when you spend an unusual amount of time on SDOT's website, you start thinking that acronyms and plans are normal vocabulary, and they're not. So if you have any questions, if I gloss over something that you don't know, it's probably something very simple. So please ask questions along the way. In Seattle, we have several different transportation agencies that provide service here in our city. I put down 3, but I'm also like WashDOT is also not on here, and Amtrak's also not on here. But it gets pretty confusing because there's a lot of overlap, especially between SDOT and Metro and Sound Transit. So Sound Transit, they operate the light rail, responsible for light rail stations, and also the Sound or the commuter rail that runs through Seattle. Sound Transit operates in 3 counties, and so they very much are distinct jurisdiction, and the city of Seattle does not directly oversee Sound Transit. And then we have Metro, King County Metro, that is, county-wide service. They operate buses. They also, responsible for some of the for bus planning and some of the bus road infrastructure and bus stops, and also operate paratransit. And then we have Seattle Department of Transportation, which is what I'll be talking about today. And SDOT's responsible for all the roads, bike lanes, sidewalks. And then where funding gets really complicated, they also help fund a lot of the light rail station planning and any of the sidewalk, roads, parking lots that lead up to light rail stations. They're also responsible for that. And then they do a lot of funding and planning working with Metro. And so they fund a lot of bus lane improvements. They oversee any bus only lanes. In the last levy, which I'll talk about, SDOT was the ones that funded all of the rapid ride improvements. And then they also fund bus stops, and a lot, we have a tax and a transportation district that goes to Seattle, but we then dedicate those funds to Metro to run our buses. So today, yeah, we will just be talking about SDOT, and there are two really big things happening this year in Seattle transportation policy. One is the transportation plan, which we are in the process of finalizing right now. This is a 20-year plan for the future of Seattle transportation. It's pretty similar to the comprehensive plan, but this is just within SDOT. And then the other piece of policy that's, I think, even more important than the transportation plan is the next levy. I'll talk about it in a second, but this year our previous levy is expiring. And so right now we're the city, the mayor's office, SDOT, and city council will be working on a proposal for the next transportation levy that then next November, we as Seattle voters get to decide if we want to pass or not. So just a little bit about the transportation plan, and I will be, I will be doing a little bit of editorializing on this transportation plan. Today, SDOT just released their final proposal, but this is a plan that, a process that started in 2022, and it was a very extensive community engagement process. I don't know, maybe some of you participated in different events. And the idea of the transportation plan is that previously we have a bunch of plans under SDOT. We have a pedestrian plan, we have a bike plan, we have a freight plan, we have a city or a pedestrian scale lighting plan. We have a transportation equity framework. So all these plans and an ADA plan. And the idea is that we would unify all of these plans together, and that would help SDOT and the city really figure out what we want to prioritize and how we can, when we fund these different plans, how we can think about them collectively as a whole system. That was the goal. And like I said, this is supposed to lay out the direction of our transportation system for the next 20 years. So SDOT did extensive community engagement, and they came together and kind of synthesized everybody's input into 6 goals that are supposed to direct all of the funding and the project list for the next 20 years. And so these goals were safety, equity, sustainability, mobility, livability, and maintenance and modernization. And this document is like 500 pages, but if you read it, there's a lot of amazing language, a lot of language that really focuses on livability and equity, about a lot of language around rapidly creating a sustainable transportation system. And we know that means reducing vehicle miles traveled and making walking, biking, and transit the most convenient options. So that's what SDOT plan says is the goal for Seattle. A couple things. We know that today, when they just released their final plan, that included metrics, and they have essentially no real metrics for getting to these goals. So, for example, their metric or performance measure on sidewalks is to increase sidewalks in good condition. So that's not a hard metric to achieve, because all SDOT needs to do is build, just currently we're building about 30 sidewalks a year, and they just need to build 31 sidewalks a year to meet the STP's goals. So it's very disappointing. And also we know that funding has not been and might not be aligned with all of the amazing things that is in the STP. And similarly to the STP, the mayor released his climate change response framework this December. This is supposed to also influence the STP or somehow be a part of the STP. And if you read this document, there is a lot of really ambitious language, really important language about how we are going to reduce our carbon greenhouse gas emissions. And it focuses a lot on livability, a lot on equity, and really acknowledges that we need to make every option more convenient than cars. Now I'm like forgetting the numbers all of a sudden, but SDOT, or the city of Seattle, had in, I think it was 2014, 2015, I'm sure Jamie knows these goals, but had a plan to reduce transportation greenhouse gas emissions by, I think it was 82%, I think by 2030, and based on the last measurements that we have, which I think is from 2020, or it's pre-COVID, we've only decreased greenhouse gas emissions from transportation by 5%. So we are nowhere on track to meeting these goals. And so this is really just to say that our city, the mayor, city council, the Department of Transit has put out these amazing, ambitious plans, and have based these plans on really invaluable community feedback. And they have there's seemingly no intention to fund any of these plans. And so I think part of our work is really to hold the city accountable that if you're going to put out these plans, there also has to be some intention to fund these really ambitious, really important goals that is so critical for everybody to move around the city, but especially communities that are getting priced out, red line communities, people with disabilities, elders, people on bikes, kids, and we really, these are our vital needs, not just road maintenance. So this year's kind of like how the transportation plan and the transportation levy is working together this year. Again, the Seattle transportation plan initially was supposed to help figure out what would go in the levy. That is a little less clear, but it was launched May 2022, and after a year of community engagement, SDOT released their draft proposal at the end of the summer, and then today they just released their final proposal that will go to City Council. And so City Council, I think I heard, is first part of April will be finalizing, making any adjustments to the STP, and we'll be adopting that this year. And then going to the levy. So the levy, and I'll get into more details on the levy, but the levy is it doesn't have to be, but it will be a property tax. And the process of the levy is the SDOT and the mayor's office, they are drafting up their levy proposal. That will be released possibly to the public for some community feedback, possibly just go straight to City Council, and then City Council has to approve and make any amendments to the levy by June in order for it to go on the ballot in November for us to vote on. And so between right now in this next couple weeks and couple months is where we as activists can really influence what's the size and the scope of the levy. And then in November we get to say if it's something that we support and want to pass, or something that we think is not going to meet our needs. So why is the levy so important? The last levy was 9 years. This next levy will be an 8-year levy, and it funds about 30% of SDOT's budget. So that is important, one, because that is a huge amount of money. And also, it's also so important because this is where a lot of the long-term projects come from. The levy has a project list and has as many buckets as SDOT includes as many buckets as SDOT includes in the levy proposal that we vote on, that it will fund. And so every year City Council priorities might change, the mayor might change, and so annual budgets change, and priorities change, and the levy will still be there, and the levy funding buckets and projects will still be funded. And so it's really a really important piece of funding and just the planning around the levy that really sets the direction of any long-term spending that will happen in Seattle's transportation planning. And so this really will set the direction of our transportation system for the next almost a decade. And then lastly, the last transportation levy total was about $930 million. That was directly from Seattle property taxes. But then the levy also leveraged over $400 million in state and federal funds. And so what that means is that when SDOT is planning what goes in the levy, they're also thinking about if we invest in Aurora redesign project, what funds are available at the state and federal level that will match the funds that we put in. And so if they know that they are going to invest $30 million per se in the Aurora redesign, which I'm not saying, which would be amazing if they do, but that they know that because that money is coming in, that they can get grants from different state and federal and private programs. And so the levy is it's so important, not just because of the 30% it brings into SDOT's budget for from property taxes, but also it also includes another huge chunk of money that you see in these local and other funds. A big part of that is grant and partnerships that SDOT was able to acquire because it had projects listed in the levy. So the levy that is expiring this year, that was passed in 2015, is a 9-year levy, and it broke down its projects into 3 buckets: safe routes, congestion relief, and maintenance and repair. And I think it's really telling that most of these 2 of the 3 buckets are really framed around cars. And congestion relief is a little misleading because it includes things like transit, but it's still framed on how we can get cars moving faster, which I think really shows you how SDOT and I think, as a city, we really frame what we think is vital in terms of our transportation investments. Here is like a little better breakdown of all of the things that was included in these buckets. But the levy funded a lot of projects, and it was one of the biggest investments in multimodal, so other modes of transportation other than cars. It was the biggest increase in sidewalk investments, in transit investments that the city made, and it was a pretty big departure from previous levies. And so that is great, although it was not nearly enough, and really shows that even modest investments from the way that we already prioritize our funding is not going to dramatically change our transportation system, because we are so rooted in funding only car-centered transportation. That graphic that Tanisha showed really is such a great visualization of how we think about transportation. And so this was taken directly from SDOT presentation I was at a couple weeks ago. And these are some of the accomplishments that SDOT highlights from the past levy that's finishing up this year. And I work with Tanisha, and so a huge focus of ours is on sidewalks. And so given that, this is how I frame a lot of our engagement with the levy and SDOT. But one of the big accomplishments they list is 222 blocks of sidewalks being repaired, and 226 blocks of new sidewalks. And that was over the first 8 years of the levy. And I think that sounds amazing. That sounds like a lot of blocks of sidewalks. But if we put that into context, that is less than 2% of Seattle's missing sidewalks and sidewalks that need to be repaired. So right now we have 12,000 blocks of missing sidewalks throughout our city. We know that most of those missing sidewalks are in the north part of Seattle, above 85th, and then South Seattle. And so it's just really hard as advocates to really know how much SDOT is accomplishing and what we are really funding and what needs to be funded when all of these numbers are presented to us out of context of the whole picture and the really the need. So again, we repaired 222 blocks of sidewalks in 8 years. There are 15,000 blocks that need to be repaired in Seattle. And we've done a little bit of budget estimates. And if we were to build a complete network of sidewalks in the next 20 years, we would need $696 million in investments in new sidewalks in the next 8 years, and $200 million for sidewalk repairs. And that is like the most conservative estimate for sidewalk repairs over the next 8 years. And that is a lot of money. And that is a huge shift from how we're spending our money right now. And that is if we wanted to have reliable sidewalks outside of everybody's door, outside of everybody's business, outside of, everybody's walk to the bus, to the grocery store in 20 years. Right now, estimates vary, but right now we are on track to build a complete network of sidewalks for everywhere in Seattle in between 1,000 and 1,800 years, which is insane because everybody uses sidewalks. And like Tanisha said, they are just such a vital piece of our transportation system, especially, if you're a pedestrian, especially if you have a disability or if you, are older, if you, also if you at night, the sidewalks are such a huge issue for everybody. And I argue, even if you're driving, you probably park your car around the block and then walk on a sidewalk. So at Disability Mobility Initiative, we worked with several organizations this fall and winter. We spent a lot of time going over SDOT's transportation plan and the mayor's climate change framework. And we took a lot of metrics from that plan and really wanted to show how much money would be needed if we were to invest in these plans that we all agree on. So if we were going to completely implement this 20-year plan that SDOT has been working on for 2 years, if we were going to do that, how much money would that take? And we did not include bridges, but we included everything else. And we worked with a lot of communities to take the metrics that were in the STP plan, but then also pull out programs that we know are important to different communities. And all of those programs were maybe not specific metrics listed in the transportation plan, but they were all in the transportation plan as something that was really important to meeting our goals. And so we spent several months coming up with these estimates. And what we found is that we will need over $3 billion in the next 8 years if we want to meet these safety, equity, mobility, and climate goals. And so a huge chunk of that, if we were to do that, needs to come from the next transportation levy. And that also needs to include all of the extra funds that the levy planning process will coordinate from the different state and federal grant programs. And it's really hard to think about when they're tossing around $1 billion here, a couple of $1 billion here, like how does that reflect how we spend our money right now and how SDOT is thinking about the next levy. And again, I'm so sorry, these are terrible slides, but I'll put a link in a moment to our report. It is very long, but you can go section by section. And we really did include programs from all of these different pieces of a connected and equitable transportation system. We laid out infrastructure to make buses move faster, increased sidewalk investments. Right now, we are building about 30 blocks of new sidewalks a year. If we want to complete the network of missing sidewalks in 20 years, we need to build 590 blocks of sidewalk. Street crossings, redesigning our 5 deadliest streets. And also with that, thinking about livability, which again, just really trying to hammer home that SDOT says they believe in this. That means community spaces and benches and bathrooms, but it also means investing in different anti-displacement measures, which is also part of these plans. And so really thinking about how SDOT can work with different agencies and when a light rail station is being planned, think about how they can invest in land around light rail stations to make sure that the businesses and communities and neighbors that have been there for a long time get to stay there and get to benefit from this new great sustainable and convenient transportation. So how does that compare? How does this over $3 billion compare to what we think SDOT is going to propose in their levy? SDOT has put out a poll this winter, and they polled on 2 numbers. So they basically asked voters if they would support a $1.2 billion levy or a $1.7 billion levy. So we have a feeling that the levy will be between these 2 numbers. We also know from the mayor's different addresses and announcements that he is focused on a back to basics levy. So what does that mean? That means he is focusing on potholes, bridge maintenance, and road maintenance. So we think that this next levy will probably be closer to $1.2 billion, and it probably will not have a lot of funding for all of these really essential programs that we need as people with disabilities, as people live in the community, as small businesses, because we know walkable, transit-oriented communities support small businesses, and that we all need really for our climate. And there's just a breakdown of what that would cost property owners. And so the difference between the 2 levies, if you have a household income of $134,000 a year, you would pay $31 a month for the lower levy, and then $46 a month for the bigger levy. And this is one poll. I just really want to drive home. This is one poll. This is one poll that just asked potential voters if they would support 2 numbers. It didn't tell really us anything about what was going to be in the levy. They did ask voters to prioritize, what would be most important to them to fund. And even with these 2 numbers, it showed that voters will likely support the higher levy. But still, we hear that their SDOT is thinking this lower number because they want to make sure it passes. And I just also want to say with the polling, I think that this is really framing what's going into the levy right now. And this is again what the mayor's going to propose, and then the city council has an opportunity to change and amend that. But one of the categories was redesigning the most dangerous streets. And I think it might have focused on Aurora and Rainier. And that was, I think, the last priority that respondents listed out of like their 20 funding priorities. And so, I think that's kind of worrisome that we're relying so heavily on a poll when we know that right now, the way our streets are designed, traffic deaths are going up and not down. And this is another really critical reason why we need to pass a levy right now that is ambitious and really meets our needs. Yeah, we have right now, we have a month or two to really influence like the size and the scope of the levy. I will say that I think the report that we released, I think is really impacting SDOT. And I think we have the power to not support a levy, to vote no, and that would be a huge deal. It would be problematic because this is, the levy provides a lot of funding that we all need, even if it's not enough. But I think like if we really use our voice and make sure that the mayor's office and the city council know that we have the power to do that, if they don't propose a levy that really meets our needs, because once we pass this levy, we don't get to come back in the next budget the next year and pass another levy. This is where our dollars will go for the next 8 years. And so if our dollars are only going to road maintenance and they're not going to any equity, transit, bike lane, sidewalk measures, we won't see any of those improvements. We won't see our transportation system shift. And so yeah, right now it's really the time to change what we get to vote on. And then I think, and I'll say I'm speaking for myself and maybe Disability Mobility Initiative, and absolutely not for other organizations that helped work on this report with us. But I think transportation advocates, because we need so much of the funding, even if we get a small piece of it, and even if we know the net, it's net negative because it's primarily going to cars. I think that we advocate as hard as we can, and then we settle for the bare minimum, and that doesn't create transformational change. And so right now is really a time where we can make sure that the city knows that if this is something that does not meet our needs, we do have power to vote against it. And I hope that we will have a levy that we don't want to vote against. But really showing that we have influence and power is really important right now. And so we have an action network set up that to send letters to the mayor and SDOT, or not SDOT, the mayor and city council, demanding that they propose and pass a levy that meets our needs and really reflects the SDP goals and represents a shift more to this $3 billion number and the priorities in that $3 billion to put us on track to meeting all of our goals. We also at Disability Mobility Initiative, we are trying to create a Seattle sidewalk pothole map because there's a huge influence on repairing potholes. And so we want to reclaim what a pothole means. And so I think Kate has a link, but if you see a sidewalk, if you see a broken sidewalk, take a picture, note the location, and upload it to this Google form so we can add it to our sidewalk map. And with that, I will try to not share my screen. Wait, how do I get out of share screen?
There should be a little like bar that has green, it'll have like a bright green color on it and then maybe a red.
Oh, I got it. Thank
Yeah.
you. And then one more plug, we showed those little sidewalk videos at the beginning. And I think that, you know, with Tanisha's work and DMI's work, we've really, I think, changed the conversation around sidewalks. The last time the levy, the Move Seattle levy was getting renewed, the polls showed that sidewalks were the last priority of respondents' transportation priorities, and this time they were like in the top I think top 5 priorities. And so these, I think the more we can talk about sidewalks and really drive home that they're for everybody, you know, the more we are really showing SDOT and council that this is like a really critical piece of transportation system that we need to fund. And so if you would like to be in a sidewalk story, I will make sure that I add my email here, and we would love to record as many sidewalk stories as we can throughout Seattle.
Awesome. Thank you all so much. We've got a couple of questions in the chat. One of them was, what kind of tax could the levy be instead of a property tax? Do you have an opinion on which form of tax would be most effective and equitable?
I mean, if we totally rechange our taxing structure, I think income tax is a lot more equitable. You know, the other taxes, levies can be fines, or which we fund our transportation benefit district, which basically council gets to kind of shuffle funds around, but most of it goes to Metro, and we fund that through a $50 car fee. So when you renew your tabs, everybody pays $50, and then through a sales tax. That is, I don't think, very equitable. And yeah, so I think, I know property tax is not the most equitable tax. It also is not our least equitable tax. And so I think, yeah, I think, you know, income tax is absolutely a more equitable form of tax that we have, and I think all of that is needed. But right now, yeah, I think right now, I would say out of the way we fund transit right now, property tax is unfortunately the most equitable way we fund transit. I think that, you know, what House Our Neighbors is doing with head taxes is really important, and capital gains tax is really important. I don't know how many other cities use those other taxes to fund transit, so I'm not sure like what is necessarily most effective, but I definitely, you know, one of the arguments that we've heard talking to SDOT about is, you know, they tell us our vital needs are our roads, and that is a huge judgment on what is vital or not. But they say that, you know, there's these other, we can ask for sidewalks, we can ask for bike lanes, and these other buckets of funding, and those buckets are, you know, our safe start to schools, and some of our sidewalk ADA funding is funded through traffic cameras, and that funding is pretty problematic. It's not necessarily equitable, but also we've had just a lot of problems with SBDS to collect the fees, and they have not been able to collect the fees. And so a lot of that projected income that we had to fund, you know, these really important, getting our kids to school safely, is really unstable. And so it's hard to project. It's hard to plan for the projects that we're going to do for safe routes to school when the funding is so variable year to year. And then our transportation benefit district, like I said, is funded by sales tax and car tabs, which I think is more stable, but also I think, you know, less equitable. I don't know if Jamie or Tanisha have other thoughts.
No, they said thank you for the answer. Does anyone else have any other questions for any of our speakers?
I have a question, and maybe it's like a little bit like too in the weeds as far as like a simple answer, but the videos with the leaves were like it felt like, oh, that's very obvious that this would be a problem for someone. And I know that I have fallen outside of my house before, slipping on leaves. And I also know where I live in Beacon Hill, the sidewalks are very uneven because of tree roots. But then we also have the like balance of climate change and needing, you know, the coverage from trees to stay cool and healthy. And like what are the, like, how do we balance those two needs and make things safe, but also
there are trees you can plant near sidewalks that don't grow up. And SDOT has a list of trees that are appropriate and don't destroy sidewalks. Unfortunately, for like, you know, decades and decades and decades, we did not plant those trees. And so we can still have, there still are trees, and that's part of what the last levy and this next levy will fund is tree planting, but we just have to plant the most appropriate trees. And then again, I think thinking about maintenance, you know, we do road maintenance. We could also fund similarly sidewalk maintenance where there is a program that regularly goes out and cleans all these leaves. But there are trees that are good for near sidewalks, that the roots grow differently than unfortunately what we've been planting for a long time.
that's good to know. And granted, I'm in a district that is historically redlined, so there is less maintenance here than I think wealthier parts of the city, and so that's also something that I should probably keep in mind.
Yeah.
There was also just a comment in here in the chat from Catherine that said sidewalks are back to basics, essential infrastructure to me. Levy before the last levy had a large focus on sidewalks, which got reallocated to some roads projects. Tried to stop that with firm commitments last levy.
Yeah, sidewalks are the most, and we've been walking longer than we've been driving. Sidewalks are like the most basic. And I think the more we can make sure the mayor and council knows that that is a basic. And going, yeah, it has been an issue that we, one, pass levies that have lots of promises. And two, if you look in the last levy, there's goals like 25, I think it's 20 goals to 25 safety projects in the you know, Move Seattle levy. And SDOT, I think, is going to complete those 25 projects. Those projects were intended when the levy was passed to include, you know, major road designs on these 5 dangerous streets, and they did not do those. They took the easiest projects and they completed those. And I think levy oversight is a huge problem right now. There is a levy oversight committee, but they are just an advisory committee. And also there's a question about, you know, the makeup of that committee too, but I guess that is also on us for activists to make sure we join those committees. But I know that's something that I don't have any good information, or I don't have any good ideas or information on, but I know that levy oversight is something that the levy oversight committee is really talking about, and a lot of people are talking about, like, this next levy. Yeah, what I mean, if we approve this levy and we pay all these taxes, it should really replicate what they told us that they're going to do. And I know that Jenny Durkin really like refocused the levy midway, and yeah, it's problematic. And I think having a stronger oversight committee and making sure that there's clear numbers, objectives, there's a clear project list in the levy that will really help. And I know there's some of that, but I think all of those things can help. But it is, yeah, it's a really good point, because it is a problem, especially thinking about, you know, there could be a couple mayors over the course of this next levy, and hopefully not, but a couple SDOT directors.
Luca, you had a question.
Hi.
Right.
I'm curious for the broken sidewalk reporting. what all counts as broken. There's a lot of Seattle sidewalk issues that are not like it's broken, it was done for either like there's no curb cut or like there's a curb cut at one end but not the other. I think those are called fire sidewalks. Or like there's on Rainier, there's like a couple spots where it like they put utility poles so that there's like barely spots to pass. Same thing in Soto. Or like places where and I don't know if this would like this is different, but like where the residents don't leave any space on the sidewalk, like all the trash cans and stuff take up so much sidewalk that you can't get by. So like what I guess all can be reported that way.
In terms of for our little story map photo thing, anything that you think gets in your way between a sidewalk. And then I'll say, if I don't know how many people use the Fix It app. I was actually just on a walk with the ADA coordinator for SDOT, and he had the Fix It app out and was just recording everything in the Fix It app, which I thought was hilarious because I was like, but you are on the other end of the Fix It app. And he's like, everyone needs to know the more input, more projects or the more programs get notified. And so there's not enough funding for all of the Fix It app, but also put all of those in the Fix It app because those all are really important too.
Anyone else have any questions?
One quick follow-up question on that was, is SDOT's definition of like a sidewalk that's in good condition, does that inherently accessible?
Yeah, so in 2017, one of the things Tanisha mentions, we don't have good sidewalk data statewide. Like most cities and states don't have good sidewalk data. Seattle is ahead of the curve because we do. In 2017, they did a whole inventory of sidewalks, and there's five condition ratings, which sound very wishy-washy because it's I think it's extremely poor, fair, good, and excellent. But within those categories, there's actually a lot of measurements, and so fair impacts fair will definitely impact mobility. I think that's not the exact definition, but fair means that anywhere from 5 to 15%, 5 to 20% of the sidewalk needs to be replaced. So good. I know I check all the time. I like near my house with like what the sidewalk rating is. I know. So it's based on like they've done measurements of like how high it's uprooted. I know the sidewalk near me that really drives me crazy is like a consistent cross slope, and so I think that didn't really register as a big cross slope. But so I'll say there are like very clear metrics that they used. So mostly I'd say they're pretty accessible, but also, if it's less than 5% of the sidewalk and that's one sidewalk pane that is just like non-existent, that's going to affect mobility. But they really are based on a lot of different very specific metrics. So it's pretty good data.
Okay, thank you.
Can I ask a super quick question? Hi. So you mentioned trees that can grow next to sidewalks and not cause problems. Is there like a link to learn more about that? Like if you're aware of a project that's going to be happening where they're demolishing a whole lot of trees and hopefully going to be regrowing some of that canopy, to like suggest that they replace it with trees that are better to be along sidewalks and streets and that.
Yeah, there is one, and I will look it up and I will send it to Kate for the follow-up email because there's a list.
Cool. Thank you so much.
Any others? Okay, I'm gonna share our we just did that. So Cece, do you want to say the actions one more time, or do you want me to do it?
I can say it real quick is, yeah, follow this action at work and send an email to our council and mayor. Super easy. And I think the conversation that I've been having at SDOT in the last weeks has been changing. So I think it really does matter. And we would love to see any sidewalk photos, or photos of any broken sidewalks. And then I guess I'm just add one more action, but we don't know the date yet. So, we are hoping to plan a rally and really turn out public comment when SDOT hears or not SDOT, sorry, council has their meeting on the Seattle transportation plan, and really show that people care about, sidewalk, bike lanes, climate and transit. We think that's going to be end of March, early April, but that's hopefully that will be soon. So keep that on your radar too.
Awesome. We put those links in the chat for you all, or you can use the QR code that's on the screen with your phone. And Kate usually takes this one, but since I'm talking, thank you all so much for coming. We totally appreciate your support, and this was an amazing workshop. Thank you, guest speakers, so much. I learned a ton, and my little research brain is happy. But we hope you'll join us next month. But until then, we'll see you all later. Thank you so much.